Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline. I'm president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, the publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then, as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on this work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading, with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share their time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American purpose with my guest, Reverend Bill Haley. Reverend Haley is the executive director of Coracle, a retreat center that's dedicated to spiritual formation and development in an evangelical Christian context. It's located at Corhaven in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, one of the most beautiful parts of the Commonwealth. And Bill is a cherished friend. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Jack. It's great to be with you, friend.
We're going to dive right in, as I do with all of my guests, and wondering how you would answer this first question. In your opinion, what was the original national purpose of the United States?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Hadn't really thought about it in those terms, and so I really enjoyed doing it. And of course, it begs the first question of what origin story are we talking about, right? Are we talking about 1619 and 1620? Are we talking about 1776? And so if you go all the way back, which I think we should actually, 1619, it was very clear that the settlement of Jamestown was founded primarily for economic purpose. 1619 was a business venture. Farther north, up in the Plymouth colony, that had much stronger shades of Christians fleeing religious persecution. So right at the very beginning, we have a mixture of national purpose at our foundation, right? And I think both of those need to be taken into account. The myth is that America was founded so that Christians could find freedom. Well, it's partly true, but not entirely true. The other part matters too. And then if you look forward to 1776, which would be the actual founding of the United States, original national purpose, well, clearly, the citizens then wanted to enjoy the fruits of their own labor, tired of being taxed on their own sweat. And I think there's validity to that. Obviously, there was a very strong impulse to self-governance and self-rule. It makes perfect sense to me. Why should the king across the pond tell me what to do? And then also, I think it provided a pretty profound opportunity for a pretty interesting group of people to experiment with a new and I think brilliant political philosophy. This remarkable combination of Greco-Roman political wisdom combined with what would be considered Judeo-Christian revelation. How can we take the deep truths of both of those things and meld them together and try to make a society out of it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting framing you begin with here, because in 1619, if we're talking about a purpose that is business related and or a purpose that is faith related, 150, 160 years later, neither of those things is explicit in the Declaration of Independence.
That is interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah. I went to Jamestown some years ago, and I had my own sort of American myth shattered, right? I grew up believing that it was all about the Pilgrims and those fleeing, for religious reasons. You go to Jamestown, I was like, oh no, they were there to make money, period, for the crown.
So given all of that, what do you believe is or ought to be the American purpose going forward from here?
Yeah. In my circles, if I was being asked that question in my circles, that question would probably come with hints of American exceptionalism. as in this is a special country, therefore we must have a special purpose. Push that even farther, you could say this is God's country, therefore God must have a purpose, right? But I just don't think that's the right place to start. Rather, I think the better place to start is what is the purpose of any country, of which America is one, right? So what's the purpose of any country? And I'm not a political philosopher or anything, but I would say essentially the purpose of any country is the care and the flourishing of its own citizens and inhabitants. Like a country exists to care for those who make up the country. This quote is often ascribed to Gandhi, but I don't think he actually said it. You've heard it, I'm sure. The greatness of a nation can be judged by how it treats its weakest members. Maybe he said that, maybe he didn't, but I think he's onto something. I do know that Pearl Buck, the American author, said the test of a civilization is the way that it cares for its helpless members. So when I think about the purpose of a nation, immediately my mind goes to, are the most vulnerable people in that society cared for? Are they valued? So there's that. And then I would also say, to push that a little further, I would think that another national purpose of any country would simply to be a good neighbor to the countries around it. At least not to try to be a jerk, right? At best, maybe even to take care of it. And in a globalized world, this has global implications. So we start, I think, where we should start, which is the purpose of any country. Now, I think we can say, well, is there anything that might be unique to America as an individual country of however many there are? And I would say to do two things well, to steward our unique position of wealth and power for the sake of others, not governed primarily from our own self-interest, but rather with the questions like, who needs the help? Do they want our help? How can we help? And because America is unique in its affluence and influence.
Well, that's interesting. One thing that does not exist in that framing, in the way that you framed it, is an understanding that most nations are founded out of either some tribal connection or some, I'll call it religion, but it's not all religious, some religious connection. How does the fact that the United States sort of eschews that kind of identity play into what you've just said?
Eschews the identity of
either being tribal. I mean, if we're tribal, it's because we landed here, not because we originated here, with the exception, of course, of our native population. And if we're a faith community, it's because of the faith that's developed here rather than the one that was imported here.
I'm really glad this is going to get edited, Jack, because I don't have a clear response to you.
Well, don't worry. It's a great question, and I'm sure it'll come up with someone else too. So listen, our society rests on foundational values. Some of them are admirable. Some of them are not so admirable. What are one or two of the values that we have as America that are worth doubling down on?
Yeah. Again, this might be more in the popular imagination as opposed to an explicit foundational value. But I think one of the most beautiful things about America is that we are, in fact, a nation of immigrants. Oftentimes, the population of people coming to our country en masse from a particular place is seen as a threat. Think about the Irish, say. But eventually, they assimilate somehow, and we realize, oh my gosh, this is one of the most beautiful things. We are a melting pot of people from all over the place. Very unusual, I think, in most countries around the world, to have that as a sense of identity, that we are a nation of people who came here. So I love that about our country. I wish it was all so rosy and smooth as what I've just said. But it's also true that every time a wave of new populations come in, they're most often perceived as a threat. So we can talk about that later. I think another foundational principle, which is an ironic one, is that every vote matters, right? Because, of course, in 1776, not every vote mattered.
Right.
Right. But at the same time, the idea is there, which is, one person, one vote. It's very, very powerful. And this is why currently for the life of me, given the context of voter suppression or gerrymandering, I just do not understand how a person can claim to be like all about America and somehow try to discount somebody else's vote. It's like, wait a second, this is us. Like, this is fundamentally us. So I love those two things about our country, and I think they're worth doubling down on, identifying where they're broken, fixing them, and living into some beautiful things about us.
So as you've alluded to, there are also some of our values that aren't so admirable, yeah, and that are holding us back from the necessary progress as a nation we need to make. Can you identify a couple of those?
Yeah, again, I don't think any of these things would be necessarily made explicit in some founding document, but they're all over it. The first one would be the ongoing legacy of white supremacy. This country was founded explicitly on the notion that white people, and particularly white men, are better. In fact, somehow more human. And so not only has that been laced throughout our history, we still continue to see the legacy of it. And so this is one that profoundly needs to be addressed, I think. And until we really address it, I think we're going to struggle to make ongoing progress. And of course, we're seeing that in our country as we continue to wrestle with this particular issue. The other one that I think is holds us back from necessary progress, and again, it's unstated, would be the notion of American exceptionalism. That is that the American way is the right way, and it must be retained at all costs. I remember with sadness, at least, in the wake of 9/11, almost 20 years ago, when the president then, who I don't harbor ill will towards, but he said, George W. Bush, he said shortly thereafter, the American way of life will not be compromised. And then he went on to say, go out and spend and keep our economy strong. And nobody blinked. Nobody blinked, as if, well, of course, our way of life ought not to be compromised. Well, what if there are elements of our way of life that actually do need to be considered and adjusted, understood, and perhaps even atoned for? And so I think the notion of American exceptionalism doesn't serve us well, actually, and that we need a dose of humility and a deep self-reflection about our nation, about our history, about our current state, the negative aspects that we have, so that we can be in a better position to, in fact, progress.
You know, it's interesting that you bring up that statement of President Bush, because it's some of the same language that we're hearing about overcoming the pandemic that we're in the midst of right now.
That's right.
All right. The measure of whether we are overcoming it is whether people are getting out to spend their money. And that has certainly that's certainly been something that has defined America in a way that makes at least some people squirm a little bit. So nice catch there, Bill. I sort of want to take a moment here.
Can I go back on that, Jack?
No.
Let me go back just a second. I remember hearing that. You know, I was in my early 30s, and I remember, and I was all about trying to change stuff, you know, trying to change the city, trying to change the country, and doing things to, like, you know, change the country. And when I heard George W. Bush say that, and nobody blinked, I realized I'm not going to be able to do anything to change my country. Like, if we don't pause after 9/11 and consider our own state, what can I do? And I just realized it was kind of a little bit futile for me to try to go for like national change. And I needed to get down to the business of trying to change what was in my immediate environment. So,
you know, there's actually an old Jewish Hasidic story like that about the man who goes out to change the world. And we don't have time for me to go through the whole thing, but in the end, he recognizes that the only thing he really can change is himself. And that's the mandate to everyone. And speaking of religion, I want to point out to the people who might be watching this, who, because of who we are as Interfaith Alliance, tend to skew significantly to the left, that though you don't consider yourself a political person, and I don't consider you a political person either, a lot of the positions you hold from your perspective of faith would be more identified with conservatives in this country than with people who are on the liberal end of the spectrum. And yet, what we're hearing you talk about now very eloquently is very much a set of the same concerns that we've heard from people across the faith and political spectrum who've been part of American Purpose. So it really makes me feel better about a sense of commonality that we have in this country about what the real issues are for the people who are quite often the thought leaders and the community leaders that America relies on.
Yeah, so, if I could just pick up on that,
please.
Here's one of the more damaging things in the last decades, I think, relative to Christianity in America, and that is that for a subset of Christianity, by which I mean evangelical Christianity, by which I more specifically mean the white evangelical community, Christianity has become very much aligned with a particular partisan position. Such that when you hear a certain term, you might think, oh, well, they must just be X party. And that's really unfortunate because as Tim Keller, a pastor from New York, points out so well, and others, Christianity in its infancy utterly defies the political partisanship that we see in the United States today. Like, they were all about caring for the poor. They were all about sacrificial service to the sick. They were all about standing up against gladiatorial camp. They were all about social action with a skew towards the vulnerable. And they also said that you should only sleep with your wife, right? And they also said, and you ought not to drink yourself silly, and so on and so on. And so there was this really strong social activist streak and a really strong pietistic streak. That's original Christianity. Original Christianity does not fit in either political party in our country right now. And so, so I would be more identified perhaps by some as a conservative, but brother, in my circles, I'm looked at as being pretty suspiciously liberal, right? And so, to be a true Christian is to feel homeless most of the time.
Well, let's continue down that road just a little bit. Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality. The first freedom in the Bill of Rights is very personal, though, and that is the freedom of religion, the freedom of conscience. What are some of the values rooted in your personal belief system that you commend to those who do not share those beliefs?
I love this question because, man, it drives me to the heart of what I actually believe. All right. So thank you for asking it. First of all, I'm a Christian. It's kind of obvious. You've said it. It's true. And so right there, like, what's very distinctive about Christianity is Jesus. Like, no Jesus, no Christianity. He is the heartbeat of Christianity. And when you look at the life of Jesus, what he is putting on display vividly, consistently, is other-centered, sacrificial love. Other-centered, sacrificial love is the essence of my faith, of the Christian faith. And so just sticking with him on that theme, we'll be safe here, Jack. We're going to stick with Jesus. Let him tell us what's essential to Christianity, right?
There you go.
So 4 things. 1, he said, love other people as much as you love yourself. That's huge. Now, he's not saying that means you've got to love yourself, and then you can out of that overflow. No, it's not that. No, it's like, love each other as much as you already love yourself. Which of us as a natural human being isn't governed by self-interest, right? So love other people as much as you already love yourself. Second, love your neighbor. And what I love about what he does with the definition of neighbor is Jesus defines it as basically anybody you see in need. Remember the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Who's my neighbor? It's the guy who's lying on the side of the road, who's been beat up and needs help. That's your neighbor. Third, and this is crazy, we're talking about Jesus, so it's going to be crazy, love of enemy. Again, very unusual in other religious, in many religious contexts. Like, no, don't just avoid your enemy. Don't just try to beat them up. No, go farther. Love them, actually. And when we go back to other-centered sacrificial love as the definition of love, I think it's pretty powerful. The last one that I would say my personal belief system that I would commend to others who don't share my belief would be this, that's forgiveness. Jesus, said his disciples, hey, you tell us to forgive. Does that mean 7 times? Do I have to forgive somebody 7 times? It's like, no, 7 times 70. What he means by that is not that they do something bad and you forgive them 490 times. What he means by that is sometimes you get hurt so badly by somebody that you've got to forgive them 490 times for that same act. Keep on forgiving. And I've often said about forgiveness that actually forgiveness is PhD level Christianity. It's PhD level human experience, right? To actually forgive when someone has taken something from you that you found of great value. In fact, if you find it easy to forgive somebody, Jack, it just means they didn't take anything of value from you.
That's a very interesting perspective. And also when you talked earlier about what the function of a country is, what you've just described as love of the other is a sequence of distancings that take place between an individual and the person he or she encounters. So, love others as you love yourself. It's easy to love others in general. But when you get down to cases, when you get down to the guy next door who won't fix his fence, or when you get down to the person who's antagonistic toward you, or when you get down to the person who has actually done you wrong, that's a radical concept.
It's radical.
Not at all consistent with what we do as a country.
No, and I think that's where, from my tradition, Martin Luther King Jr. continues to be a man worthy of great study and emulation.
A topic we might get into another time.
Mm-hmm.
How would you say our society should pursue our national purpose?
Yeah. Together.
Good.
I mean,
shortest and uniquest answer I've had.
Yeah, it's just, when we think back about what I was saying about what is America's purpose, what's the purpose of any country? Okay, the care and flourishing of your own citizens, and especially the weakest, the most vulnerable, and then being a good neighbor. It's like, golly, if we could rally around that and simply try to do that together, that would be great. That would be great. I don't know where I picked this up along the way, but it's an unfortunate truth that what really motivates people, what really galvanizes them, is a common enemy. So you think about the 1940s and 50s, right? I mean, America was all in on fighting commies. We had a national purpose because they were the enemy, right? And then over time, you just kind of change enemies. What's really sad about right now, Jack, in my opinion, is that what has happened is that we've split in our own society so that the enemy is actually the person who doesn't hold your political views. And it's a failure of imagination. How about the enemy being hunger in our own country, right? How about the enemy being the way that certain folks have access to certain things and others don't? How about that as a common enemy? Can we work together around that? So yeah, together, bro. That's what I would say. How should we do it? We got to figure out a way to do it together, and we're struggling right now. We're struggling. We're fighting. We're fighting.
Let me reference again the epiphany that you had after 9/11 about your role in the world and your goals in the world. What role does the individual play in pursuing our national purpose?
Yeah. Well, you already quoted him. And this one, I do think Gandhi said, it's futile to try to change the world. Rather be the change you hope to see in the world. That's really trite. I mean, it's a great bumper sticker, but man, it's true. That at least the first thing that I can do is try to embody my value system in my own life and context, right? So if I'm working against racism out there, it means I've got to work against racism where I live. That I can't always be out there without working on my immediate context in my own sphere. So I would say for an individual, an orientation toward the community and common good as a frame. So, it's not just that, let's just imagine a suburban street fenced off, by houses. It's not simply that we are coexisting together on the same street. No, you're actually my neighbor. And by virtue of that, I actually have some responsibility for your well-being. And I actually have a responsibility for the well-being of all those in my neighborhood, that I have an orientation toward the common good for all people. And to push that even farther, wouldn't this be nice? Maybe we'll get there. Not only you're not just my neighbor, you're actually my family, right? This orientation toward, I'm not just living my own isolated life. I actually have some sort of corporate obligation for those that I'm in life with, even if it's merely by proximity, because somehow we're related. Somehow we're part of the human family. So related to that, then I would push that farther and say that includes the good of all people, not just my people. And again, like I said, with an orientation toward the vulnerable. So the human family, not just my tribe. Like if I, as an individual, can reflect on the fact that there is one human family and I'm a part of it, and everybody on the globe, regardless of whether I agree with them, look like them, whatever, they are my brother and sister. If I can work on that orientation as an individual, I think that would help. Enough individuals are doing that, enough individuals coming together saying, hey, let's quit fighting because we're actually family. Although maybe families do fight, I don't know. But you get my point. And then that can translate, of course, into various sorts of civic affairs, community service, civic service, that sort of thing.
Well, what's wonderful about that perspective, Bill, is that whether you look at it from a biblical perspective or you look at it from a scientific perspective, your premise is not only defensible, it's the foundation of what we understand about each other.
Yeah, let's pause on that, shall we? And just talk about the Human Genome Project and what it shows about the differences between the races, which is that essentially there are none.
Right.
And the way that race differentiation was developed and articulated in the 1500s and for what purposes has been utterly toxic on our globe. Utterly toxic. We are humans. We are family. Our body tells us that. It's, as you say, it's in the science. It's in the science. It's how we're made.
Yep. Are you optimistic about America's future?
That sounds like a trick question. So again, let me start maybe from a different place. I love my country. When I graduated from seminary, I had a chance to travel around the world for about 16 months out of 25, 30 countries, something like that. And I remember feeling like, there is a stewardship that comes with the privileges that have been afforded to you by virtue of being an American. You need to be a good steward of your Americanness. Like there are privileges here that are not all that normal. So I love my country. And I could go on about that. And I could also go on how much I grieve for my country. I could go on about that. That said, let me just say, brother, my hope doesn't revolve around America's future. Like whether or not America prospers is not the ground of my optimism. I don't look to America for my deepest identity or my greatest hope. Again, I'm a Christian. Therefore, I'm not looking for American primacy. I'm looking for Jesus. And I'm looking for the breaking in of the kingdom of God. I'm looking for when what God wants done gets done. right? The God who, by the way, we should remember, whose essence is love. So Jesus is my reason for optimism. Now, back to your question. I remember encountering the insights of Sir John Glubb. Do you know that name?
I do not.
He wrote a book, and he's British. He wrote a book that was published in the mid-70s called The Fate of Empires. You remember Gibbon's stuff on the rise and fall of Rome, right? And all the parallels about America. Well, this guy, as a historian and sociologist, after a military career, he looked over all the empires to see what sort of commonalities he could find about what are the denominators here, what are the trends. And what he found was, it's fascinating, what he found was that the average temporal existence of an empire, whether it be the Assyrians or the Romans or the British or whatever, is about 250 years. And he charts it, he traces it, and he shows you, right? And he then breaks it into 6 stages of rise and then decline. The last stage, by the way, he calls the age of decadence. So, but I mean, 250 years. I mean, I know, brother, and so do you, this country will not be an empire forever. It's going to end. It's the way things go. I don't know that you and I'll be around to see it, but mindful of that. I'm not, when you come to the question, am I optimistic? I do believe we are at what feels to be a turning point in our identity. Are we as a country trying to preserve sort of the foundations of WASP primacy? And when I say that, of course, that's self-indicting, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominance. Is that who we are? Or are we, in fact, a melting pot? Do our differences actually make us stronger? We're at a turning point in our history where we've got to continue to reckon with race. White supremacy and then also Christian nationalism, it does not want to go easily, which we saw vividly displayed on January the 6th. And so am I optimistic as to whether or not we can turn here, whether or not these transitions can be made? I'm not sure. I think so. One of the foundational values, or at least identity things, is that America can do it, right? So I think we can, but some of the ills of our society don't want to go easily. They don't want to go quietly. What happened on January the 6th and everything leading up to it was striking in its imagery and volume. And so sometimes, if I want to feel really optimistic, I don't think you're going to like this as you enter into your golden years. I've heard it said that progress moves forward in a hearse. You ever heard that?
I have not, but I've heard versions of the notion that leadership is lost.
Yeah. And so, are there some things that are really deeply rooted in our past that will eventually die off with small little outposts here and there? Maybe. That's kind of dark. So am I optimistic? I think so, but I'm not sure. And it's a really important time that we're living in. And then I would just come back around and say, but you know what, regardless of what happens, remember, Bill, you are an American second, and you're a Christian first. Your hope is somewhere else. So get down to business and start loving folks. Do your best.
What a very rich conversation for a couple of kids from Chicago. Listen, before we leave, tell folks if they want to learn more about Coracle and the work that you do out there, how they can find out about it.
Sure. Yeah. Just go to our website, www.inthecoracle.org. That's INTHECORACLE.org.
It's a great site. You do some great stuff out there, and I encourage people to take a look. Thanks to you, our listeners, for engaging with us in exploring the American purpose. It's been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Reverend Bill Haley, who shared his perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes at AmericanPurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and at interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.